I shall use no rabble-rousing platitudes to introduce him, and let me simply say, with affection, great admiration, and the utmost pride, entering even now from the center field bleachers, Eugene McCarthy.
Some others are eager to enlarge the conflict. They call upon us to supply American boys to do the job that Asian boys should do. They ask us to take reckless action, which might risk the lives of millions and engulf much of Asia, and certainly threaten the peace of the entire world. Moreover, such action would offer no solution at all to the real problem of Vietnam.
This war is not just about South Vietnam and North Vietnam. It's about the monolithic power of Communist China and its intention, declared intention, to spread over the balance of free Asia. In my belief, if Communist China is not stopped now in its support of conquest by revolution, Communist China, it may not be possible to take the risk of stopping them later.
Our hearts cry out at the misery and the loss of life in Vietnam. And to the families that have had to share so much and bear so much, any complaint that they make is understandable. But some who complain the most have sacrificed the least. And some who seem to know the most have been there not at all.
I don't know when I decided to run. I decided, I think, that someone had to challenge the president. Probably when Katzenbach appeared before the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate and explained what we assumed was the Johnson interpretation of the role of the president in foreign policy.
I'm Emile deAntonio. I made this film 18 years ago, and I'm intervening in it now in July of 1987. The year 1968 provided us with one of the great and pathetic elections of our entire history. One candidate was murdered, another withdrew. It was a time of violence, of fragmentation, of harshness, and finally of hopelessness. The winner-take-all in the election was Richard Nixon. As I approach the end of my own life, I wonder what has happened to American generosity. We were a generous people. We have lost that generosity. I think instead that we have pawned our future to that dim actor who has a hydrogen bomb for a curtain call, to Colonel North and Fawn Hall, and even the CIA.
In August 1967, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held rather extensive hearings on U.S. commitments abroad. The principal witness for the administration was Nicholas Katzenbach, who was then the Attorney General.
To him flow all the vast intelligence and information connected with national security. The President of necessity has a preeminent responsibility in this field.
Mr. Katzenbach said at one point that the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was what he called the functional equivalent of a declaration of war.
But didn't that resolution authorize the President to use the armed forces of the United States in whatever way was necessary? Didn't it?
Well,
what could a declaration of war have done? That would have given the President more authority and a clearer voice of the Congress of the United States than that did.
Senator McCarthy rose from his seat and left the hearing room. I asked him what he thought of the Attorney General's testimony and the position that he was taking on the war-making powers of the president and the role of the Congress, and particularly on a functional equivalent of declaration of war, and he said that he thought this was the silliest testimony he had ever sat through, and he then added, I think this whole issue has got to be taken to the people.
I conclude that if this was really the judgment of the president, that in a way that the engagement in Vietnam was secondary, and that more important than that was really the conception of the role of the presidency in the field of foreign policy, in a way that one was challenging not a particular commitment of the country by a president, but rather challenging his basic understanding as to what his power and what his responsibility and what his role was. I didn't decide then that I should run. I think I decided that there had to be some kind of effective and significant and really kind of a showdown challenge to that point of view.
I thought that there was this general sense of discontent in the country and disillusionment with Johnson's leadership that even transcended the issue of the war, that people just felt things were not going well, and that if you ran a campaign on the basis of attacking the quality of leadership in this country, that the desire for change and that the general disgust, really, with the quality of leadership we were then getting, not only in Vietnam but across the board, would be enough for somebody to win the election, and it didn't have to be a well-known figure.
Motivating me to take a stand against my president and my party was coming to Dartmouth as an administrator and looking out and seeing students protesting the war and protesting it very responsibly and legitimately, and the debate and controversy, and no one listening. The president wasn't listening, the Congress wasn't listening, the senators weren't listening, no one was listening.
It's hard to recreate the desperation that many of us, certainly I, was feeling at that time, in the fall of 1967, at the time that David and I had lunch together. Was it October? I had just returned from the march on the Pentagon, and I was fighting within myself whether or not to take a fling in the sort of half-assed Kennedy effort without the senator's blessing in New Hampshire.
Robert Kennedy was concerned about the fact that he was going to introduce the president at this dinner because, of course, his fact that they had conflicts and animosity were what was well known. And on the other hand, if you're the Democratic senator, when you're called upon to introduce a Democratic president, you obviously don't do it with an introduction which is an attack.
The height of his aim, the breadth of his achievements, the record of his past, and the promises of his future. All these bespeak the largesse of size, that magnitude of effort, that intensity of devotion, and that importance of accomplishment. He came to lead this nation at a time of uncertainty and danger, pouring out his own strength to renew the strength and the purpose of all of the people of this nation and of the nation itself. He is the head of our nation and of our party, our commander-in-chief and our chief diplomat, our chief executive and our chief spokesman, and the chief repository of our hopes and our fears, our advice and our consent, our complaints, and yes, our prayers. I am very proud that we have in our midst President Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States.
Clearly not an expression of how he felt about Johnson, and sounded phony and was phony.